It's not a good time for people like me who are, for want of a better word, I don't identify as a neoliberal, but I guess I am. I believe in free trade and free markets and free speech and all the rest of it. And that, I think, is being now threatened. There's two left-wing arguments against globalization. One is pity for the people who are in the factories now, and the other, kind of paradoxically, is pity for the people who are losing their jobs in the factories in Britain. The Trump kind of critique doesn't really care about the people who are working in the so-called sweatshops, but he is worried about the people who are losing jobs in Pittsburgh. Ultimately, they both, from their different perspectives, have arrived at the same conclusion, which is globalization is a bad thing. And I find that quite worrying.
Chris Snowdon from the IEA.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for being here. I think if you're watching this, you might be surprised that PoliticsJOE has the IEA on. But I invited you for this interview because you tweeted something, and it escapes me now what it was, but it struck my interest because it was about identity politics, and you were talking about the left, and it was actually something that irritated me also.
It was Sadiq Khan going on about his dad being a bus driver.
Yes, and it was because Andrea Leadsom had been described as a former pageant winner, and she'd also worked at Greggs, which I think is absolutely
not
fine.
Not Leadsom, the other one.
It's not Leadsom, is it?
The one who won the reform.
Yes.
She's called?
Jenkins.
Jenkins,
yes. She gave you the middle finger once.
Did she?
She did.
Yeah, I saw that photo.
Yeah. The least flattering photo that's ever appeared of me on The Guardian was me looking, going, why? But it interested me, and we're going to get into it, but we're going to start with a very contentious issue, which is smoking.
Oh, let's start with that, yeah.
Wes Streeting last year, there was a lot of talk in the press about banning smoking in pub beer gardens. Would you back that legislation?
I would be appalled by that. I don't smoke anymore. I haven't smoked for a very, very long time, about 12 years now, because I just vape. But that's clearly next in the firing line, as are the nicotine pouches that I use. I think smokers should be defended. They're an embattled minority. If they want to smoke in a beer. To me, look, this is really about private property rights. I oppose the original smoking ban on the basis of private property rights. No problem at all if private companies want to ban people from smoking. If every pub in the country decides of its own volition to ban smoking, I wouldn't have a problem with it. I don't think they would, because I think there would always be a market there for people who want to be in a smoky pub. And non-smokers go, well, I'm not going to go in that pub because that's the smokers' pub. But why couldn't we do that? Why couldn't we have private members clubs, some private members club being a cigar bar with a big sign on the front saying this is a cigar bar. If you don't like smoking, don't come here, don't work it. It could have been done. It's actually most countries that is kind of how they do it. But the anti-smoking lobby is so strong here that they really resist any kind of exemption, because they know if you have a bit of a carve-out for anybody, any business to start with, there will never be any public demand to go for a comprehensive ban. And so they push very hard for a comprehensive ban. The original 2005 Labour manifesto said they were going to exempt all these, what they call wet pubs, pubs that don't serve food. They were going to exempt private members clubs.
They were going to get rid of wet pubs, were they?
They were going to exempt wet pubs from the smoking ban.
Oh,
It's just going to be pubs where they serve food, because I guess it's not very scientific, but I guess they thought, well, people get particularly annoyed by smoke when they're eating. It was a manifesto commitment, so they got re-elected on it, but that wasn't to be. And that banning smoking in beer gardens, it's very, very explicitly just about stopping people smoking, right? It's not about protecting people from secondhand smoke, the risks of which are minute anyway. It's just about making life as difficult as possible for smokers.
You see, what traditionally the left would say is companies like British American Tobacco have for a long time been able to lobby or talk up the values of smoking, which is incredibly dangerous for you, and you shouldn't have a big conglomerate dictating legislation in a country. But I sort of side more with the private property. You should be allowed to do what you like.
It's a way of manipulating people on the left by Puritans. There's no reason why the left should be in bed with these killjoys to start with. Right? It's nothing I understand, socialist economics or left-wing or progressive thought. That has nothing to do with stopping people drinking or gambling or smoking or vaping. It's just a way of manipulating them because you just say, well, you don't like corporations, do you? Well, there's corporations making money out of this. It's like, well, I'm kind of, if I was a smoker, which I was for many years, I'm kind of glad there's a corporation that's growing the tobacco and processing it and making a quality product at the end of it. 'Cause I don't want to be growing the stuff myself, which we'll end up doing in a few decades in this country. Yeah, people make money out of these things. Yes, we don't want them lying to us. I think it's a very, very long time since BAT were talking up the benefits of smoking. They wouldn't legally be allowed to do it. Yeah, they lobby, seemingly very ineffectively, but they've got every right. They're a FTSE 100 company. They've got a right to have their voice heard. But it comes down to politicians, what they do in the end. But I think it's very manipulative of people such as, I don't know, George Monbiot, for example, just to say, you're going to go in this very illiberal direction because you don't like capitalism and these horrible big companies are making money out of it. Well, yeah, they will. What's the alternative? That the black marketeers make money out of it. Are we on the side of the black marketeers? It's a huge illicit trade in tobacco. Are they the good guys? We want to be letting them make the money? I genuinely think some people, not just on the left, but just, in general, would genuinely rather have criminal gangs making money out of tobacco than they would the tobacco industry. I think the same is also true with drugs, by the way.
Well, I was about to ask you, does this extend then to marijuana? Would you legalise cannabis then?
100% I would legalise cannabis and quite a few other drugs. And if that means that corporations make money out of selling drugs, then great. There are some left-wing kind of legalisers like Transform, the kind of pressure group Transform. They're very pro-legalisation. They would, in theory at least, legalise heroin and cocaine. But they don't want big businesses making any money out of it. And so every time they propose a kind of pathway to legalization, it's always kind of ineffective, really, because it's just kind of glorified decriminalization. So you can buy it, but no company is allowed to sell it, or at least is not allowed to scale up to any size that would make it a useful company. I don't agree with that. I'm quite happy with corporations making money as long as they're suitably taxed and regulated.
Do you think this is a wider conversation about nanny state? Is it about intervention or government intervention in what you're doing?
It is for me, 100%. I work at the IEA. We're a free market think tank. We believe in, obviously, free markets and personal liberty. And I have this niche of talking about what we call lifestyle economics, which in practice is the drinking, the vaping, the smoking, the gambling, and the sugary drinks, and all the rest of the good things in life. But yeah, they're under attack. Partially just from public health killjoys, but they get support from people on the left who just don't really like people making money, but also from this good old-fashioned traditionalist Tory paternalists like Lord Bethell, for example, who's come out last week saying it's not good enough just to ban anybody who's born after the year 2008 from ever buying tobacco. We should just ban it completely, which of course is the way it's going, and it's always been the way it's going. And this is, I wrote a book getting on for 20 years ago about this slippery slope of this kind of legislation. They're going to ban tobacco, they're going to ban cigarettes, they're going to ban nicotine products, and then they're going to go after, and they already are going after, alcohol and gambling and various forms of sugary drinks and fatty foods and salty foods and all the rest of it. It's unstoppable. It's a runaway train unless politicians develop a backbone and start seeing these, for want of a better word, nanny state measures as being a mark of shame rather than a badge of honour.
But on the other side of that, you've got people like Lord Faulkner, who was the Justice Minister, who is always talking up legalising cannabis and legalising. Well, actually, he's more on the line of decriminalising certain drugs.
They always are. That's the problem.
The left can be a broad church.
What good does decriminalising really do? You decriminalise cannabis, it means that you can possess cannabis. You can maybe grow a bit of cannabis for your own personal use and you won't go to prison. How many people actually go to prison for possession of cannabis? Virtually nobody.
For possession, but then, you can, if you have a little bit too much, you've got possession with intent to sell.
You'd have to have a lot too much. And even then with cannabis, you probably wouldn't go to prison in this day and age. It doesn't really solve the problem. The problem of the war on drugs is it has created a massive, very dangerous, very violent black market. And you're not going to address that by making the supply of it completely illegal. It's nice for a few people. In Portugal, they've completely decriminalised drugs. Okay, that's good. If you're a heroin addict, you won't go to prison. You'll be put into some kind of rehabilitation scheme. It's worked quite well. I think it's better than the system we've got, don't get me wrong. But it doesn't really deal with the underlying problem of prohibition, which is the criminal supply chain.
Would you tax drugs?
100%, yeah.
So
I
what
would probably tax them at 100%, actually. I mean, I've written a piece about this, about how much you can make, how much government could make if it legalised and regulated and taxed cannabis. And it was the best part of £1 billion a year.
Is that all, really? I would have thought it
Well,
would have been more than that.
That's the problem these days, isn't it? That we think £1 billion a year is nothing. There's not actually as many people consume cannabis as you might think. It's dropped a lot. Now, of course, if you legalise it, more people might consume it. Although that's not really been the story in most of North America, where it has been legalised. So you can't count on that. And obviously, a lot of people wouldn't want to see a huge number of people start using it. But I'm talking about a tax at what I would consider a reasonable rate, which would be VAT plus maybe 30%. As compared to like the tax on cigarettes, which is VAT plus 800% or something, okay? But the tax on cigarettes is so high that you've got a very big black market, and one of the main points of legalising drugs is you get rid of the black market. So you've got to have the illicit products sold at a much lower level than the illicit products, otherwise it's kind of futile doing it. So I suggested VAT plus 30%. Obviously, if you want to try and make more money, you can increase that. But the fact is, it's better to have £1 billion and not have to spend so much money on enforcement for what is basically a victimless crime than to not.
You look after gambling.
I look
as well,
after it.
the IEA.
Yeah.
Gordon Brown last week, he talked about a potential tax rise that could be implemented on gambling. He was talking about taxing on source. Is that something you would support if it meant that there was still gambling wouldn't be touched then for the next decade or so?
There's absolutely no guarantee it wouldn't be touched. It's, again, another slippery slope. We started off with the fixed odds betting terminals a little while ago, if you remember those, in betting shops, the roulette machines, they were effectively banned. That didn't seem to have any positive effect on the problem gambling rates, and now they're going after gambling advertising, gambling sponsorship, online gambling especially. I think, I mean, trying to just look at this purely from the point of view of the public finances, I think that we are pretty much squeezed as much money as we can out of the online gambling market. The reason I say that is remote gaming duty is 21%. That is I think, of revenue. It's not even a profit, okay? So a big difference between taxing revenue and taxing profit. Then you've got corporation tax at 25% as well, and all the other taxes that businesses have to pay.
He's talking about taxing at source. He's not talking about taxing the companies. He's talking about taxing the consumer.
Yeah, I don't see how you can do that. I mean, what is the difference in practice?
Well, a lot of gambling companies are offshore, so that would mean that you'd actually be able to get some money into the exchequer.
But how would you tax the consumer for an offshore, unlicensed, unregulated website? It doesn't make any. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Brown.
I mean, this is the thing. This is one of the things that gambling differs from things like alcohol and tobacco, precisely because you can't put an excise tax on it. People choose how much you spend when it comes to gambling. You can stick a $5 on a pack of cigarettes. You can stick a tenner on a bottle of whiskey, and because it's an excise tax, it'll obviously be passed through to the consumer. You can't do it in the same way with gambling. All you can do, as far as I can see, is tax the companies, and that will only get passed through to the consumer through things like predominantly worse odds, which would undermine the online bookmaking industry in this country, which I'm sure anti-gamblers would have no problem with, but this is not supposed to be an anti-gambling measure. It's supposed to be a revenue-raising measure, right? And that would just encourage people to go to these unregulated offshore websites.
But would they be able to use them? Because I understand... Would they actually be able to have access to them? Like the normal
really
Joe
easy.
on the street, would they be
VPN.
able to access?
Dead easy. I mean, often you don't even need a VPN.
I mean, I can't imagine
there are
it.
thousands of white label gambling websites. The Gambling Commission is closing them down constantly, but it's whack-a-mole. If you're into gambling, you will find a way. You can go to an odds checker website and you look for the best odds, and if the best odds happens to be on an illegal offshore website, you'll go to that website. It's never been a massive problem in Britain because we've usually had a fairly sensible, laissez-faire approach to regulating the online industry. But that, I think, has given the Gambling Commission a false sense of security, thinking like, okay, we haven't got that many people using these illegal websites, therefore let's bring all this regulation. They've got the affordability checks now. There's talk, as you say, of putting in a tax up. I think we're getting to a tipping point. We may even have passed it now with the affordability checks, which are very off-putting. You imagine going on a website, you're a high-stake gambler, and the website says, can you give us your bank statements? You know, are you going to do that? Would you want to give your personal details to an online gambling company? Not particularly. Yeah.
But then is there a case that perhaps some people are lured in by a company who wants to take their money from them? And so
That
perhaps
is
they
what
need to
advertising
be
is.
protected?
That's what advertising is. It's companies trying to lure people in to spend money with them.
Because you look at sort of like pay later companies that have come to dominance in the last few years or so, companies like Klarna, you know, they do lure people in. They make it cheap, or they facilitate spending money that you don't have.
Well, the Wongas and companies like that.
Well, no, Klarna, which is sort of like an interest-free pay 30 days later. It does a very soft credit check. It doesn't actually, it will never show up in any credit report. It just basically decides, have you paid things back before? If you haven't got a CCJ, you can borrow now.
Right.
People are in thousands of pounds worth of debt because they're lured in.
Yeah.
Do you not think the government needs to regulate for that sort of addiction?
I think they don't they? I mean, aren't these heavily regulated? I mean, Wonga was regulated out of existence. And it's not necessarily a good thing, because Wonga actually was an alternative for a lot of people to the local lending shark. You've got to look at the unintended consequences. But I don't think this has got anything to do with the gambling industry per se, unless you're just saying that it's just wrong that gambling companies try and get people to gamble with.
Yeah, and spending money that they don't have. I think that's the concern, isn't it? I mean, was it a good move that you're not allowed to gamble on credit cards anymore?
I wasn't really against that, although in principle, actually, I am against it. I think if you've got the credit, you should be able to spend that money on whatever you want. But I don't think it was the biggest infringement of liberty of my lifetime, so I wasn't really kicking off about it. And now, of course, because no one's using cash, the government is looking towards getting debit cards for fruit machines and things like that, which you can see there might be an argument against that. But what do you do if people haven't got any cash in the wallets anymore? Look, I'm not against, I'm basically a libertarian at heart, but I'm not against things like, let's stop people using their credit cards to gamble online. I could see how if you're a problem gambler and you manage to get a new credit card, and it is easy to get a new credit card a lot of the time, that's going to get you in trouble. To me, that's a relatively liberal harm reduction policy. But we're not dealing with reasonable people who are interested in harm reduction when it comes to the anti-gambling movement. These people hate gambling, and they want to wipe out every form of gambling that they can find bit by bit in the same incremental way that they've dealt with tobacco, in the same incremental way they're going to deal with everything else. It's all just the salami slicing of liberty, and each part of it individually seems not worth kicking up a fuss about.
I think that we need to talk about identity politics.
Yes.
I think we should talk about the left.
Okay.
From an outsider perspective, when you look at the left, do you think that it has been encumbered by identity politics?
I think it is now, yeah. I mean, because the whole world is going to the right in a way that I am not particularly thrilled by. It's going towards the populist right. There is a backlash against, for want of a better word, neoliberalism from both the left and the right.
Always from the left.
It was been from the left for a lot longer than it has been from the right. You're quite right there. Yeah, I remember I grew up reading Naomi Klein and all these kind of books, and I hated the World Trade Organization, whose main purpose is to get rid of tariffs. One of the good things actually about Trump's behavior in the last few months is that most sensible people are suddenly actually really pro-free trade and really against tariffs. But the left 25 years ago was very comfortable with tariffs and protectionism. They were against globalization for slightly different reasons than people like Trump and maybe Farage are today. But nonetheless, both the left and the right have turned against globalization, outsourcing, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it.
But the trade unions have always been against.
Yeah, because they're the old left.
Right.
So yeah, the old left have always been a bit suspicious of mass immigration and globalization for obvious self-interested reasons. And people like Naomi Klein are kind of absorbed that. They also were imbued with this kind of just general anti-corporate mentality, that you mentioned before, against Nike and Gap and Kodak and all these companies that were supposedly invincible back in 2000.
Yeah, but it's the use of cheap labour, right, that is undercutting, trade unionists in the United Kingdom, because obviously in the United Kingdom, when you've got protections around the labour market, you're not able to pay people £2 an hour.
There's two sort of left-wing critiques of globalization, both of which involve cheap labour abroad. One is that it's undermining domestic workers, British workers in our case. The other is that this is exploiting people in the third world who are in sweatshops, which is just really...
What is this?
Well, what is a sweatshop? It's just a factory, really. We don't talk about the Industrial Revolution sweatshops in 19th century Britain. It's just more pejorative. No, we don't. We talk about how bad they were, perhaps, but we don't use the word sweatshop particularly, right?
Workhouses, we do.
But most people would acknowledge that that was a necessary process to go through to get to the civilization that we have today. The Industrial Revolution.
Maybe on your side.
Oh, really? You don't like the Industrial Revolution?
Well, look, yeah, but I don't think that we would talk up the benefits of having of workhouses and of the means of production. You know, I don't think that that's something that the left is particularly proud of. Yeah. And also the left is pretty critical of of globalization, I suppose, or of the empire. I mean, that's something that regularly comes up in
sure,
you know,
okay.
we're still fighting for reparations for many of the countries that suffered for Britain to be built.
Yeah, okay. But I mean, be that as it may, factories, you know, used by Nike in Bangladesh, I think, are better than factories in Manchester in the 1830s, as documented by Engels and Marx.
Should that be the barometer?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, in a way, because Marx was not against industrialization, right? He understood, like any historian would do, that there's a reason people left the countryside to go work in the factories, because as bad as they might seem to us 200 years down the line, you actually made more money and had a better standard of living in places like Manchester. Certainly by the end of the 19th century, life was significantly better. So yeah, it's a process of improvement that was necessary to go through. The agricultural revolution, followed by the industrial revolution, followed by what we've got now, which is outsourcing a lot of these jobs. And the nativists complained about it, said, no, we want to be working in factories making Nike shoes. But do we? Who actually wants to be doing that in America? No one, really. It's just nostalgia for a bygone era. But my point is, there's two left-wing arguments against globalization. One is pity for the people who are in the factories now, and the other, kind of paradoxically, is pity for the people who are losing their jobs in the factories in Britain. And the right, the Trump kind of critique, doesn't really care about the people who are working in the so-called sweatshops, but he is worried about the people who are losing jobs in Pittsburgh. Ultimately, they both, from their different perspectives, have arrived at the same conclusion, which is globalization is a bad thing. And I find that quite worrying. And people on the left, well, clearly they find people like Trump worrying, but it's not a good time for people like me, who are, for want of a better word, I don't identify as a neoliberal, but I guess I am. I believe in free trade and free markets and free speech and all the rest of it. And that, I think, is being now threatened by a global backlash against free market capitalism.
Really?
Well, it's a good enough term. I mean, I'm a liberal, really. The neo was just put there by people trying to make it sound more sinister.
But if you believe in, low tax or free markets, then should the government be subsidising these huge private companies that are doing a public sector job?
Which ones?
Well, if you look at the rail, for example, some of those networks are now being brought under the government umbrella. You look at South Western Railway, that's just become Great British Railway.
Very excited about that. Yeah.
But the taxpayer is still going to be paying for the rolling stock, paying for the actual carriages.
Well, it's been nationalised, so yeah, they would do. That's what happens in nationalisation. You'll see a lot more subsidy from the taxpayer and the national...
That's neoliberal.
What, nationalising industries and then subsidising? It's not neoliberal. No, that's left-wing.
We're arguing it's not nationalisation. We're arguing it's only nationalisation in name only.
Okay. Well, nationalise it completely, for all I care, but they will be very, very heavily subsidised by the taxpayer. And your ticket prices won't go down, and they won't be on time.
Well, I mean, I'm going to agree with you there.
Right. It's not going to, that's another one it's another hill I'm not going to die on, is rail nationalisation. And I certainly won't die on the hill of water nationalisation, which I think has actually been a disaster and a huge...
water nationalisation?
Sorry, privatisation.
Right, okay.
For correcting me. Yeah, I think that's been a disaster, particularly Thames Water, and a huge failure by the regulator, actually, who could have done something about it. I don't really feel strongly about privatising natural monopolies. It's just there aren't that many natural monopolies. Water is definitely one, I would say. gas and
But
electricity
is
are...
rail not one?
No, it's not. Because you could have had a privatisation in which, like, take my line coming out from Sussex to London. It's Southern Trains, and Southern Trains are pretty bad, but it's only Southern Trains. There's no reason you couldn't have had two or three different operators running the trains. Now, that wouldn't stop the signals going and the other kind of problems that you get on the railways, which, by the way, are the responsibility of the already nationalised Network Rail. But it would mean you could at least choose on the basis of price, comfort, maybe what the bar is like. There would be some competition to try and drive up standards. So no, rail clearly isn't a natural monopoly. It was created by private companies in the first place. And healthcare is not one either. There's only one rail line.
Yes.
Yeah, but that doesn't. You can have more than one train company on it.
Well, no, because you'd have to rent it off of. That's the problem that they're experiencing.
Rent it off who?
We have to rent it off of Network Rail.
No, not necessarily.
You do. You have to rent the space off.
Well, that's because of the botched privatisation that we did. You don't have to do anything. We could just allow companies to put rolling stock up and down the railways.
What private company would want to take on all of that financial burden of building a rail network?
They don't need to build the railway, no. They just need to get the rolling stock. The railways you can use, right? This is how it was already done. Network Rail is a nationalised monopoly and does quite a bad job and is actually responsible for the vast majority of the delays that you get on the railways.
Yeah.
Okay. But what was botched about the privatisation was just saying we're going to have one operator operating each regional line. So there's no competition. One of the few examples actually is if you go up to the northeast where I'm from, there's a company called Grand Central and they compete with LNER. And Grand Central is actually really good. And you can see that there is price competition and competition about the quality of the service. It's a little bit better than it is in the rest of the country. So no, railway is not a natural monopoly. Healthcare is not a natural monopoly. Education is not a natural monopoly. Water, fine, I'll give you water.
Why do you think healthcare is not a natural monopoly?
Well, again, look around the world. You know, there was healthcare long before the government got involved with healthcare. You can have hospitals competing. You can clearly have doctors competing. Most of Europe has all sorts of different operators building and running hospitals. We are so parochial in Britain that we're just used to the idea of the NHS not just giving us universal access to healthcare, but actually running the whole show. That's the problem with the NHS. You can have universal healthcare. The whole of Europe has universal healthcare. Everywhere in the Western world has universal healthcare free at the point of use, apart from America, basically. But the governments don't try and run it. They don't own all the hospitals. A lot of countries, even in Scandinavia, would think it was insane that the government was owning and running all the infrastructure of the healthcare system.
Well, it doesn't own all of it.
It pretty much does.
Rents a lot of it.
From who?
Well, some of it. I mean...
Oh, the PFI stuff, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that was a stupid Blair thing, but I mean, it's all effectively the state. There's a tiny fraction, really, of the health infrastructure is private. But even that shows that it's not a natural monopoly, right?
It depends how you're defining a monopoly.
A natural monopoly is just when you, as I say, water being the obvious one. In order to have genuine competition, you would have to have another company build all the water lines going to your house. It's just not practical. Telephones back in the old days were a natural monopoly because it was impractical to have another company create all the telephone lines. Mobile phones is far from being a natural monopoly, right? Because of this technology.
Okay, but look at emergency healthcare in this country, for example. If you say you had a child at a private hospital and that, God forbid, went wrong, where do you go? You go to the NHS hospital, right?
Yes. A&E and ambulances are more of a, they tend to be state-run.
And the structure
Even in
of
America.
that, So the structure of that, I would argue, is a monopoly because you don't have a choice in what emergency vehicle comes to...
You could in theory, but in practice it would be, I agree, it would be like the police, right? It would be too difficult to arrange. But that's a pretty small fraction of healthcare coverage and spending.
We didn't quite answer the question there about identity politics, did we?
No, are we finished?
How are we? Well, you need to go, I do think.
Yeah.
Do you want to have a brief discussion about class?
Yes.
Do you think that class influences how a person votes?
Doesn't seem to anymore. I was looking at elections going back to 2010, and none of those elections saw a significant kind of influence from class. In other words, working class people were no more likely to vote Labour than middle class people, and middle class people were no more likely to vote Tory than working class people. I didn't go back any further than that, but that's quite a long way. And there's been some weird elections along the way because they've been influenced by things like Brexit and stuff like that. And the last one was like kick the Tories out. But even in the kick the Tories out one, it wasn't like working class people overwhelmingly voting Labour. There's a realignment. My colleague Stephen Davis has written a lot about this. There's a realignment of British politics gradually happening. Well, it started gradually, now it's happening really suddenly. It's kind of bizarre that you had in 2019 Boris Johnson win a big landslide. 2024, Keir Starmer wins an even bigger landslide, and now Reform are on course to win another landslide. This is clearly not a country in which people are voting very tribally based on the basis of anything, let alone on class. The real division is age now.
Really?
I have no idea.
No, but can I
have
say
no idea.
things like this? I was saying 6 months ago that it was obviously between Reform and Labour at the next election, and oh my God, the heat that I got. I just think it's so clear and obvious. Glad to hear.
The Reform, well, I mean, that's what polls say. I don't particularly trust the polls, and obviously Reform could do all sorts of daft things in the meantime to ruin it for them. And it would be a truly extraordinary thing if they did win, because they would have hundreds of people who've never been politicians before, let alone be MPs before. But the public are very volatile. I don't think the public, to be honest, really knows what it wants, apart from it wants lower taxes and more public spending, and it can't have it. And it's angry now that it can't have it because the borrowing has run out in practice. And we spent 25 years borrowing
I'm
lots
going
of
to
money.
disagree with you. This is where our fiscal...
Oh, the fiscal
Oh,
rules.
you don't believe in the fiscal rules, yeah.
All right. Well, the fiscal rules are obviously arbitrary, so you could say them, so you could change them. The thing is, all the fiscal rules are doing, and you're right, they're not actually rules as such. The rules are there to second-guess the bond market, to prevent another mini-budget explosion. The mini-budget, for all its many faults, had the one silver lining, which it showed people that actually austerity wasn't a political choice, and you can't borrow endless amounts of money, and there will be repercussions for it.
Is that how you
Now,
interpreted it?
Bond yields, yeah, because it led to this crashing of the pound, a huge rise in bond yields, and everyone moaning about the size of their mortgage. A lot of that was overblown because everything was going that direction
But it
anyway.
was uncosted borrowing. That was the problem, right? So
Yes.
you look at Rachel Reeves and what she did with her budget,
Yeah.
and we could argue that I would argue it didn't go far enough.
Mm-hmm.
But she moved the fiscal rules to mean that when they were embarking on an industrial project, then that would balance the books because you were able to offset.
Yeah,
Right. So,
she changed. She's already used a lot of wriggle room.
but you could have done that in 2010, is what I mean. You could have decided, like, I think it was the Osborne government that decided that they weren't going to build nuclear. If they had built nuclear and amended the fiscal rules to mean that they would balance.
Oh, they
the
could.
books
Yeah,
that
sure.
way,
Yeah. Look, I mean, who knows what they could have done? The point is, you're trying to second guess the bond market. You don't actually know how investors are going to react, and it's how investors react that makes the difference. We had very low interest rates for a very long time in that whole period, and there were a lot of people saying, quite justifiably, this is a good time to be borrowing to invest. We didn't borrow to invest because we were borrowing to spend. That's the problem. We weren't. We were borrowing a huge amount of money. We weren't really investing it. If we'd have been, like Reeves is trying to do now, actually, if we'd have been frugal with the day-to-day spending, we could have borrowed some more money to invest, but we weren't. We were borrowing just for day-to-day spending and pay for benefits and public sector wages and all the rest of it. So that opportunity is now gone. We don't have low interest rates anymore. Bond yields now, 30-year bond yields are the highest they've been since 1997. 10-year bond yields are the highest they've been since 2008. The government is looking at around about 5 to 5.5% to borrow, whereas only 3 years ago it was virtually zero. And yet people still say we need to borrow more money. Well, where does it end?
I do think we need to borrow more money. I think that what we're arguing is we need to tax more. We need wealth.
Fine. Well, that's a much more respectable position. I mean, Rachel Reeves either needs to cut public spending or tax more. I would have a lot more respect for her if she did one of those two things. But people don't want, like I say, the public wants lower taxes and more public spending. And so governments for 25 years have done their best to accommodate an irrational public.
An irrational public.
Well, it's irrational to think that you can, pay out more than you're taking in.
I don't want to leave it there, but I know that we have to.
Well, I'll happily come back sometime.
Come back. We'll talk about class properly. Nice to see you.